I'll wait till the recording. There it is. All right. Well, welcome. Great to see you, Jonathan, and welcome everybody to the ADDA webinar series. I'm Alan P. Brown, creator of ADD Crusher at addcrusher.com. I'm delighted to see this gentleman over here. I haven't seen him in a long time, and he's always got great stuff. I want to do a little bit of sort of preliminary stuff. I'm going to introduce this fabulous guy in just a second, but I also want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Listen, if you're an ADDA member, if you're an ADDA member, thank you for being a member. You're the lifeblood of this amazing organization, the largest and longest standing organization that helps ADHD adults like moi. And if you're not a member, consider joining. It's like $5 a month. And there are tons of benefits, not just total access to all the webinars and the replays and all that. There are over 180 past ADDA webinars featuring a whole gamut of ADHD experts, and it is all free to ADDA members. $5 a month, folks. Also, there are now, what's the number here? Now, over 30 peer support groups under different topics. Really, really cool stuff. Additional housekeeping, please keep in mind that your bandwidth, other things might be stealing bandwidth. I pause my Dropbox syncing. I quit my email. I quit all kinds of stuff. I close all the other browser windows so that all of your bandwidth can go to this fabulous presentation. Let's also remember, folks, we've got a big international conference coming up in November. And if you haven't signed up for that, it's a virtual ADHD conference again this year. Do consider that, all right? And I don't know if there'll be a link to that, but definitely there'll be a link to join if Janine hasn't already posted in here. I think that's it for the housekeeping. I'm gonna hand things over to this handsome guy over here from down under right after I read his bio, okay? Everybody ready? Anything I'm forgetting? All right, so Jonathan Hassall is an ADHD and executive function coach and director of Connect ADHD Coaching, providing services internationally from Brisbane, or as Americans say, Brisbane, Australia. Wonderful, wonderful city. His background includes nursing and psychiatric services and ADHD expert roles in the pharmacological industry, including national clinical research scientist and scientific advisor. There's some nice credits there. As an active member of national and international professional ADHD associations, he provides individual and group programs nationally and internationally and speaks regularly to professionals, community, and industry. Jonathan's focus is to translate EF theory, executive function theory, to ADHD coaching, facilitating individuals with ADHD, helping them find and accept their neuronative state, creating effective adaptation, environmental safe. I love that, the neuronative state. With that, I'm going to bow out and I'm going to hand the reins over to you with that fabulous penny behind you. Great to see you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for that lovely intro. And hello, everybody. Welcome. It's always nice to catch up with the ADDA crew. And one thing I obviously need to add to my CV there is I'm now a board member of ADDA as well, which was a great honor to be asked to join. So it's a wonderful organization, and thank you all for making it what it is. So today we're going to talk a bit about time. And I've entitled this talk "How to Now," which I hope will become very obvious as we go through it. So let's get started. So today, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about what time means if you have ADHD. And when we talk about time, I'm talking about the experience of the past, the present, and the future. Then I want us to understand maybe some theory, and look, you know, a lot of neurobiology, particularly when we branch into neuropsychology, is still theoretical. However, there's what we're learning is, you know, continually supporting and bolstering what we already understood. But I think it's always worth looking at that. Then obviously we're going to talk about some solutions around time in terms of how I deal with time. And most importantly, and particularly with ADHD, it's this thing of taking a change and making it reliable, making it so that it's there for you whenever you need it. It's not something you did once and then, oh, I forgot about that and didn't do it again. So who am I? Well, Alan gave me a lovely interview, so I won't talk about myself too much. But what I want to highlight is I'm an ADHD coach with a neuroscience background. So what that means is I came across neuroscience of ADHD first, and then I came across coaching because, to be honest, I was looking for the missing piece. I mean, there's wonderful psychiatry, medication, psychology, and even OT, other therapists out there. And I was thinking, but there's something missing. And you know, I was running a national conference here for ADHD for one of the big drug companies. And I was introduced to the one ADHD coach in the country at the time, I believe, or the one formerly trained ADHD coach. This wonderful lady called Michelle Toner. And brilliant lady, brilliant coach. And within 5 minutes of talking to her, I terrified her because I almost jumped up from the coffee table we were sitting at over in Perth and said, "You're the missing link," which is not usually what you hear when you're out meeting someone for the first time. and in doing so, it sort of brought together a whole pile of things around ADHD and how we can change in one swipe. So when I come at this is where I'm coming from. Firstly, it starts with the client, with the person. And I have ADHD. I didn't realize I had it till supposedly I'd been an expert in it for several years, and it was quite amusing to everyone around me when I realized it. However, we got to start with you. I mean, who you are, how you do things, how you want to do things, who you want to be, what you're dealing with and what you're facing and where you are in your life. So always with coaching, we start with you first. The neurobiology, now this is part of my neuroscience background, is that I like to know how things work. And I think that's a bit of an ADHD trait. We do love to tinker and figure things out. Now, the neurobiology is fascinating because if we look at how the brain wants to work, then often we can figure out what's getting in the way and address the problem at a very basic level. Then we need to think about the psychology, in other words, of how we think, because that's another layer on that neurobiology. Like we actually direct our brain function through how we think and vice versa. And finally, but not at all least, my overarching view of all of this is the ADHD coaching lens. And the thing I love about coaching, particularly in the ADHD sphere, is while we acknowledge and recognize past things that have happened, and you know, as my partner Monica says, she's also a coach, it's all good information. What we really want to do is look at what can I do next that's going to define my future. What can I change? Because, you know, the past is the past. It's done. It's finished. It can still be having an effect on us, but we can change that as we move forwards. So let's define where we're at. So, you know, I could sit here and rattle off a whole pile of ways in which ADHD, well, people with ADHD struggle with time. But really, here's the questions for you. Is my challenges with time impairing my potential? Is it having an impact on myself? Now, whether it's just, as I've said, potential, or in any other way, in terms of achieving things you want to achieve, or feeling like you've lost the day when you thought you had heaps of time. The impact on the others around you, because, you know, we're social animals. We don't live in isolation. And time is this little pact that everyone has made about this is how we're going to measure the passing of our existence, right? So if they're not living in the same time sphere that we are, then we're going to have conflict. And, you know, I do a lot of work with couples, and that's certainly one of the primary problems between couples. And then how does change feel? So if we're saying that maybe we want difference here, we want something to change, we got to also address, well, what's change going to feel like? And change feels uncomfortable. We're going to do things that feel clunky and weird to address this thing that we want to improve. Now, the reason I bring this up is that with time particularly, one of the feedback I hear a lot, either through groups I run or through individual coaching, is that there's all these barriers to change. And often we can feel like, well, no, that's just who I am. I don't do time. Okay, I'm not, yeah, well, that's, you know, where the rest of the world can suffer along. I don't live in the same time constraints as they do. And you know, in a sense, I'd certainly indulge in that at times. But the thing I always challenge is that in terms of barriers to change with ADHD is, let's be sure it's just because you don't know your potential. You know, that you know, we've grown up like this. We've grown up with it, you know, having a brain that we haven't learned how to drive because no one has shown us. So, you know, is it just that we think we can't? because I'm here to tell you can. The not knowing how it all happens, why I'm having trouble, and that's why I like to talk about the neuroscience. Or having no models for change. You know, recurring theme I've heard lately from particularly a lot of the women I coach is there's not a lot of great role models for women in ADHD. Now, I've corrected them and said, of course there are. There's these wonderful people called Sari Solden and Michelle Frank who've written this fantastic book. There's also Jessica McCabe's a wonderful model for ADHD in women. But you know, there's still not a lot. So and I'm sure there's others that I haven't mentioned, so apologies for those. But for most people, as you discover you have ADHD, particularly as an adult, it's, well, where are my models for change? And also there's no sense of reliability in change. You know what? I've fixed this a dozen times, and this is why I attacked the reliability bit on the end. I've fixed it. I can do it right that time, but then I don't keep doing it. And we've all struggled with that. So if you're not ready to address ADHD in time, and if you want to stay in your own bubble of time, that's fine. That's where you're at. That's okay. Please stay with us, hear what we're going to talk about, and maybe there'll be some insights or cues there for you. If you're ready to change, in the famous words of a fellow who was American, then became Australian, and is now, I think, American again, Mel Gibson in Mad Max, you talk to me. Okay. So, what's the average experience of time? So if we think of past, present, and future. So most people will exist in the present. They are here. They are now. They're constantly checking in on now. And when they look at the past, they see it as a linear series of events. They'll often even have a really good sense of the spacing of those events, which is important because they're seeing it from the context of now, not from the context of then. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. When they look at the future, they do something really cool. They project out into the future, way into the future, and say, what do I want for myself in the future? And they project themselves into that future. So if they're thinking about their retirement, they'll project themselves into whatever retirement activity they like doing, like, I don't know, fishing for marlin or something. I've long since resigned to the fact that I'll work till I drop because I enjoy it. But that's what they'll do. They'll see themselves doing it. And then what they'll do is they'll deconstruct it. Really tricky. They don't try and reinvent the wheel. They say, well, that's what that looks like. How do I build that back in steps to now? Notice we've ended back up at now. Okay. So what do we do with ADHD? Now, one way I like to think of ADHD is that we tend to have this pancaked past. We don't seem to have the same sense of linear time. So what we do is we have all these strong emotional events that sort of get squished up together in their own little pile. And I've probably made that pile neater there than it really is. So, and unfortunately, a lot of these events are tied to strong emotional responses to things, and they're quite often negative emotional responses. Because negative emotional responses, our brains are built to give them more attention, because that's how we manage risk and we stay alive. Okay, these things that stand out as different. And in fact, when we think about, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but probably not go into the amygdala too far, the amygdala is actually a contrast center. It looks for these big events that are very different in experience, and it triggers very strongly to these events, which is, if you think about it, it's probably good for keeping us alive. But with ADHD, if you grew up thinking you were wrong a lot of the time because no one understood how your brain was working and you didn't, then you're going to have more of these than most people. So, and when we think of the present, we are very present, and hey, that's one of our strengths. So let's hang on to that. That's what we're good at. We're good at being in the here and now. I often say we have one time zone, and it's right now. Anything else is just a nice potential, but right now is real, okay? And that's why we have to wait for things to come to us often until we can really feel that we can engage and act on them. But one thing we don't tend to be good at is tracking time as it passes, which means we don't have a concept of the scope and shape of time, which is problematic in terms of how we manage our time and we manage things within our time. Now, the other thing too is with the past, when we do recall it, because often it's through a triggered emotional event, and when I say an emotional event, I'm talking about any association, and we'll talk about that in a bit more, so you'll know what I'm talking about then when we get to default mode. But basically what we do is we bring that past event into now. Now, that's very different from looking at that past event from now. So when we bring that past event, let's say I did something stupid when I was 20, and yes, there is a shopping list of those things. So I bring one of those events that I sort of am maybe a bit ashamed of, or feel like, why did I do that? Well, it's crazy. And I bring it into now. I feel like it's happening again now. I know it's not. It's not that I'm delusional, but it feels like it's now. Because what I'm not doing is I'm not separating who I am now from who I was then. I'm not able to look back and say, oh yeah, I was 20. You know, it's a few years after 20 now for me. And when I was 20, there was a whole pile of things I didn't know. That I had ADHD. I was sort of running on reactions. And a whole pile of other things I didn't know. And so I made mistakes. And you know what? Me, at this point in my life, looking back now, that's cool. But we'll talk more about that. But that's not what we tend to do. We tend to bring it in and have that emotional reaction now, and it will sit with us. And it'll feel really horrible. And I'd be really interested in your feedback to hear who in the audience can experience that. They remember something that they went wrong either last week, last month, or 10 years ago. And they bring it into now. They get triggered into bringing it to now, and it feels like it's happening again. So the other thing that we want to think about is the future. Now with ADHD, instead of projecting out to this future place, and there's some wonderful work by Tim Pitchell and also by Yves-Marie Blouin-Houdon. I'm hoping I got them around the right way. So Yves-Marie, if I didn't, I'm my deepest apologies. Wonderful psychologist from Canada. She also does some wonderful work with creativity. But she did some cool studies where she looked at how people who procrastinate and project in time. Now, she didn't identify these people as having ADHD, but in my book, she may as well have, because what she's describing is really common with ADHD. That we struggle to project ourselves out to that future outcome. Now we can imagine it, we can logistically pull it together and say, yeah, that's what that would look like for someone. But as a rule, it doesn't tend to be me. And you know, a great analogy for this I thought was, or example of this was, there was a Simpsons episode where Marge and Homer are inside and the kids are outside playing, and Marge says, Homer, the kids are out playing, you should go and join them. They're having a wonderful time. This, you know, because if you don't, you know, in the future you'll regret it. And Homer's turns around and says, oh yeah, but that's okay. That's future Homer's problem. I'd hate to be that guy. Right? So that's what we don't do. We don't associate very strongly with our future self in that situation, which means it makes it very hard to not only motivate ourselves now to something that's not now, but also too, we tend not to deconstruct backwards because we never got there. What we try to do is we try to build, how would that feel if I built myself out from now? Now, and unfortunately, and quite possibly it's working memory related, or most likely attention related as well, is that as we try and build out, it gets harder and harder and harder because there's more variables and we just can't hold it all in our mind. You know, what's going to feel like for me in 3 weeks is difficult from here to project, because lots happens in my life in 3 weeks. So the one thing that we do tend to do, we tend to bring it close and we tend to make it emotional. So either something I'm passionate about or something where I'm under threat. And then when it's close enough and that either that reward or that threat feels immediate enough, then we can activate to it, which explains a lot of why we leave things till deadlines. You know, I was coaching a lovely creative down in Sydney here today, and she was talking about exactly that. She's wonderful. She can do lots of things, but she said, I leave it till the last minute. I leave it till the deadline because she hasn't developed a system for creating those incremental steps across time. So what we need is now, hence the title of this talk. So if we think about this again, we need to own that strength we have of being very centered in the now. It's a wonderful place to be. It can make us focus incredibly in this moment, and it's joyous. I think we could magnify it a bit by becoming more self-aware. And as we go forwards, we'll see that it's also helpful spreading outwards. But to be present in the moment, but then also to align it with time passing so that our intentions get fulfilled. So in other words, be right here, right now, but also be aware that right now is, well, it's 10 to 10 my time in the morning. I'm not quite sure. I think it's probably like whatever in your time. I'm not quite sure. 10 to 8. There you go. But being aware that, okay, this is where I am in this moment now. I've got all these other moments ahead of me for this day, which, other people call minutes or hours. So I can actually start seeing all these other potentials that I can achieve in a day. And also, more importantly, I think, what I don't want to achieve today, that it's okay. We don't have to pack our life into our single moment. We can have lots of single moments across the day, the week, the months, the years. The next thing we want to do with our past is we want to see it from the perspective of now. We want to be able to reach back, see that's what happened, acknowledge that's where we were at then, but most important, acknowledge the difference of where we're at now. And to project ourselves into the future, we want to be able to take ourselves emotionally to that future place, feel what that feel like, and then deconstruct it back. And as I said, Eve Marie did this wonderful study with uni students where she got them to visualize the night before their exams if they had done regular study. And there's this beautiful little recording, and I assume it's a Canadian, but he's saying, you look at your books, they're on your textbooks are on your desk, they're like old friends, they're well worn and dog-eared because you've looked at them so many times. You feel like you understand and know what's in everything. It goes on and on and on. They just listen to that same recording 3 times a week for the course of the semester. And they saw a dramatic improvement in engaging with acting now for that end result. So how are we going to get there? Let's understand what we're talking about here. So a really cool thing to think about, and there's been a resurgence in looking at this lately. Pardon me. And most recently, I heard some great work by Andrew Huberman, who's an associate professor, or professor, please, Andrew, I apologize if I demoted you, at Stanford. He's a wonderful neuroscientist. He talks, he's got his own podcast, but he also, I believe he's bringing out a book soon. But if you look back through any podcast, he's appeared in multiple spaces. And he talks about a lot about the neuroscience of the brain. It's not ADHD specific, but I encourage you, listen outside. Neuroscience outside of ADHD is incredibly informative for ADHD, because as you listen to it, you'll go, oh, wait a minute, I don't do that. And which is a big clue, right? So interoception versus exteroception. So now interoception is largely about, sensing my temperature, my respiratory rate, my heart rate, my sensations in my body. I would expand that a little bit to saying it's about me now. It's about how I'm feeling, how I'm thinking, what's going on for me, what is my experience right now. Exteroception is everything outside of us, including things that trigger memories of our past and things like that. So I would lump your past outside of yourself as well. Now, tying those two together, by having awareness of both of those, we create context. And context is about time, it's about space. Now, if we can maintain a strong focus on ourselves, so self-awareness and the me and the now, we have a strong tie to the external things, because we're able to see them from a perspective that is consistent. We can see them from us. If, on the other hand, we have less attention to us and we're biased to the external stuff going on around us, then what happens is we tend to get a weak connection of context. So in other words, it damages that connection with the relevance of time and place, because we've lost our major point of reference. Now, with ADHD, one of the things that I see consistently is that we have a bias towards the external. Now, it's quite possibly because of how our neural networks are biased, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the problem with it is that if we're constantly reacting to our environment, even to triggers that remind us of our past, or distractions now that are taking us away from a further held goal, then we're going to have trouble keeping that context of time and space in place. And I think there's a lot more to come in terms of this. So now I mentioned neural networks, and look, I'm aware we're doing a bit of a flying visit through a lot of neuroscience here, but I just want to touch on you that these are all relevant areas to be thinking about. So we think about the neural network, which is referred to as the default mode network. Now this is relatively new, it's probably about the last 10 years, 11 years, it's come up in neuroscience. It's being much more broadly spoken about now, which is fantastic. And we're still figuring out what a lot of it does. But when you lay across what we've discovered in terms of default mode network and ADHD, what it appears the relevant bit, I think, for this is that it's our walking around network. It's where, as we're walking around, we're making quick associations with the world and referencing them via those associations. So in other words, if I'm walking down a path, I'm George of the jungle, and I'm a bit hungry, and out of the corner of my eye I catch a flash of yellow high in a tree, then my tummy will grumble before I even register the word banana in my head. Because I like bananas, I know they're yellow, I know they're high in trees, I've got all that stored in my general experience of life. And that flash triggers that association even before I consciously think of the word banana. Now, this is a really useful thing to have, and it's basically our fundamental emotional state. And I would argue it is our full emotional state that we extend on this by adding meaning to it. So we create these associations. It tends to be fast. It tends to be a bit vague and fuzzy. So it might be that person just reminds you of someone that you had a bad relationship with. And so they trigger sort of defensiveness in you even as you meet them. But it's usually what people refer to as like a gut feeling. It can also be positive. It could be like with George and the banana. It's something I want and I want to motivate towards. However, it's based on old information and fast associations. The next part is we need to turn on attention to bring detail to now. And you notice that turned down the default mode network. So this is the task positive network, also referred to as the central executive network. Main thing, I would call it attention for our purposes. So what this allows us to do is it bathes the brain in alpha waves, leaves only some of the neuronal clusters still firing because they're the ones specifically relevant to the information we're trying to, define. So what we do is George looks up at the tree and yeah, that's a banana tree and that looks like a banana. So now George is pretty positive that is a banana. We have confirmation. So what that does is George then passes that message back to the default mode network that says, yep, story is go, we have banana in that tree. And so that creates that motivation because that will then project, well, when I eat a banana, it tastes good and I feel good and it gives me energy. So yeah, let's go for it. Now, so when we talked about that interoception, that me now, we need our attention to do that. We need to be able to direct our attention to the internals because by nature, we are biased. Everyone is biased to external triggers. So to turn on our attention, to forcibly direct it to specific things and turn down all those emotional triggers that are going off requires effort. Now with ADHD, we know that's one of the areas we struggle in. And look, the current theory, and always happy to be updated on this, but the current theory is that we don't have enough consistency of dopamine availability in that part of the brain that allows us to switch on the attention easily. We need usually a strong dopamine hit through an emotional means, either a threat or appeal. So as you can see, there's a good reason, theoretically, why neurologically we struggle to turn on that attention to me now and to distill the things we want out of the external to our benefit. And then obviously I should finish this story. If we can't turn our attention on and we try and solve it with our emotions, we arrive at an experience which I'm sure everyone with ADHD has had, which is referred to as fight, flight, and freeze. And my very clever partner, Monica Hassel, and Barbara Brisky-Hunter wrote a wonderful paper and gave a presentation at one of the conferences about adding the word fib to that list, the fourth F. Because that's one thing we also do. We also will automatically tell a little fib to reflect our intent rather than our action. And it's a really common feature with ADHD. You see it in kids, but with ADHD, we seem to carry it into adulthood, which is not surprising because, younger kids have underdeveloped executive function. Not for their age, but compared to an adult. So we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fib. So in other words, we stop thinking about it and we just turn into act. We have to either get ourselves away from it or defeat it or try and stand really still so it doesn't get us. And a lot of that is, a good example of that freeze is, I see a lot with uni students. As I run a program for uni students where they will freeze looking at that blank page. They cannot think, they just feel such an immediate threat from it. They can't act. So now, if we're setting that default mode network, we also need to be aware that that's largely, as I said, our emotional center. That's where we do that automatic reactional emotion. But it's also too where we take the detail that we've formed from our attention to create a new story. And by the way, that's a strong potential there. We can recreate those reactive stories. I often tell couples that, when they find they're highly reactive with each other in a negative way, that you trained each other into doing that. Your default mode network learned that's what you should do in that situation. So the promise there is that we can change that. We can change that automatic reaction. It doesn't have to stay that way. And there's some really basic ways, particularly with couples, where you can do that, where both are actually modifying what they do and being more transparent in what they do and describing what they're feeling and thinking as they do it. Okay, let's get on to emotions. So we got a simple emotional drives, which is basically this lovely flat little plane of we're either motivated towards something, motivated away from something, we're either agitated about it or calm. So if I'm motivated towards that banana in that tree and I'm really hungry, I'm probably going to be a bit agitated. If I'm if I don't like bananas, then I'm probably going to motivate away from it, but probably fairly calmly because it's not threatening me. Okay, so that's what we think about as this simple level of emotional drives. I want to highlight this because it's problematic with ADHD because we do think. We do apply a lot of meaning to things. And so we create these really complex emotional stories that can really get us bound up. When really what we need to do is we need to simplify it by creating a nice attentional engagement with it. And that's one of the strategies we're going to talk about today. So, I hope you're all still with me. Now, the other thing we've got to think about is we have ADHD. So there is some basic system management things we need to be aware of. Now, this is a little model I developed a few years back and I've used consistently with people. And I call it the ecosystem. And it's had a couple of incarnations. But basically, when I think about ADHD, first I want to think about the ecology. So the thing we live within internally. So there's our body, which includes available energy and capability. There's our executive function, which, okay, I know that's a function of our body. However, because with ADHD, we know there's problems in that area. It's deserving of standing out on its own. Then we have the external stuff in our ecosystem, which is the world around us, people, place, time, and situation. Now, all of these things interact with each other. So something in our environment or in our world can have a direct impact on our executive functioning. Equally can have a direct impact on our body. I'd say if it's really hot and there's lots of mosquitoes around, we're coming into summer here, so I'm conscious of that. Then that can have a massive impact on our ability to direct our attention at something, or if our seat's uncomfortable, or if people around us are distracting. Equally, people around us can be supportive and help us do focused work, which is why a lot of people are struggling in COVID working at home, because the office environment provided a really great structure that supported attention to work, emotional regulation to being in a workspace, and all that sort of stuff. Equally, our body, whether we're tired, hungry, or haven't moved enough, is going to impact our executive function directly through dopamine availability and other neurochemicals. But also, too, we use our body to change our environment and impact our world. So, the great promise of this is, it looks like a lot going on, but the reality is if you change one thing, you're going to see a knock-on effect of improvement right across the board, which tends to improve a lot of things. Like often just changing where you are will have a significant impact on both your body and your attention. Now, how do we regulate this? We use systems. So, and the systems I like to think about, these are like rules or little processes that help us balance all these this ecology out. And the first thing is we use identity. So we have an overarching operating system or operating goals for our existence called our identity. It's our values. So if we follow those, we tend to feel good and happy. If we do not follow them, we tend to not feel good and happy. Okay, life doesn't tend to work as well. The other part of our identity is our strengths. So if we are in tune with what we know we do easily and well, then we can utilize that to do the things that are maybe a bit harder normally for us. The second thing is our experience, and this is a double-edged sword. This is both our experience, our learnt experience, so what the default mode is reflecting on, but also too, it's the experience we want. Now, when I work with people, a lot of them are a bit shocked at the idea that you can choose how you're going to feel in the future. But that should be our goal, because we can do that. Lots of people do it every day. In fact, you have done it. When we're really looking forward to something, we've already decided that we're going to have a fantastic time. Okay. Now, while we're in that time, if we keep that in mind and we keep directing our attention to what is the positives, we will have a fantastic time, even if it turns out terribly in other respects. So manipulating our experience is really important. And finally, we need strategy. We got to have little systems of rules that make it work. Now, with ADHD, that's something that, we often can develop maladaptive strategies like, I will leave that work right until the deadline because that's when I do my best work. Now, we only believe that because it feels easier. The reality is it's never our best work the night before. It can't be, right? So it's about making sure the strategies work for us and are repeatable and are reliable, which is something I'm going to come back to later in this idea of how do we create reliability. So let's move on to solutions. Okay, so how to now. The first thing with anything to do with ADHD, we have to be prepared to interrupt the autonomic response. The autonomic response is that default mode reactive stuff that goes on. So it's pretty pointless to be sitting there and feeling overwhelmed by memories of a terrible past thing and just say, okay, I've got to change my relationship with that past thing now. No, first we have to change how we're feeling now. So I call this creating the stage for change. Now, this would also apply in an argument with a partner. It would apply anywhere where you're struggling and feeling overwhelmed. We need to stop and take a pause. Or, thinking about a future thing and thinking, I feel really overwhelmed by even thinking about how I'm going to do that. Create the stage for change. So that's why I showed you that ecosystem. We got to optimize our ecology. We got to make sure that our body's okay, that we're not tired, that we're not hungry, that we're not sort of been sitting in one spot for too long. We're going to make sure that our executive function is firing, because it may or may not be firing because of the body or for other issues. We've got to make sure that what we need is at hand in that point. So, for example, if we're feeling really overwhelmed, our working memory is not going to take in anything new. So we need to go and get unoverwhelmed. So it might be about removing ourselves from the trigger or having a nap. One of my uni students the other day just said, yeah, whenever I hit the wall, I just go and have a nap. I don't care what time of the day it is. I go and have a 20-minute nap and I come back and it's never a problem. Okay. So create the stage for change. When we go and do that, create the stage for change, and this comes from a lot of the current neuroscience that's out there, and there's been some wonderful stuff around this coming from COVID. Andrew Huberman, again, is one of the big, one of the big contributors to this, but there's lots out there. But with ADHD, the first thing we got to do, we got to notice that we're not doing well, and we're not good at that. We have to be able to flag it, and this is where people around us can be helpful. If you've got someone you trust who's in your life, they don't have to solve you or fix you, but they can be really helpful at saying, hey, you okay? Are you doing all right now? Do you need to take a minute? And people will do that. I've seen people do that in boardrooms. So we need to be open to hearing that and then actually saying, okay, well, maybe I'm not okay right now. Maybe I don't feel good. Maybe my heart is pounding. Maybe I'm feeling overwhelmed. So then to address that, we need to stop. And I can't stress this. The conscious pause. I can't stress it enough, I should have said, is that we need to be able to, and I actually would say, stop, right? Let's stop the bus and then move. I'm going to get up and I'm going to move from wherever I am. So if, there's a reason we tell people who are arguing to walk it off, okay? We're making them move away from the debate. They're moving away from the triggers, but they're also moving away from that association of being in that place. So I like to move, and I like to move somewhere where I can use my eyes. Now, our eyes are part of our brain. They're the only part of our brain that stick outside our head. And they have a job. They are a direct line to our brain. So a great way of calming ourselves, if we can make our eyes defocus or look into the distance. The reason we love looking at views and vistas is because it releases a neurochemical in the back of our brain that says, oh, it's okay, relax, we're okay. Now, you could probably speculate that developmentally that possibly come from being able to see danger a long way off or the absence of it. But whatever, if you go and you stare into the distance and then do some breathing, you will calm down. And the breathing I call it double tap. People talk about box breathing, but there's lots of different ones. But my double tap, which probably exists under other names, is that you take a full breath in, and without releasing any, you top it up, just as though you're like hyperventilating to dive, right? And then you breathe it out slowly, so longer than it took to breathe it in. So the idea is that what you're doing is you're oxygenating, and as we boost up our oxygen levels, it also tells our brains, hey, chill, relax, it's okay. Because usually when we're stressed, we shallow breathe. So we get higher carbon dioxide levels, and then that sends signals to our brain that we're in trouble. So notice, stop, move, use your eyes and breathing. Okay, now, and I'll just throw in here too, in terms of interrupting these autonomic responses I mentioned before, if we're having a fight with someone. So to any of the interested bystanders, as I like to call you, who have someone with ADHD in their life, in terms of time for change, this little timeline is really important. So the focus usually when we're interacting with someone and they're losing it over something is around what I call the incident. That's where we scream, shout, throw something, cry, storm off, collapse on the ground, whatever, okay? That is not the time to fix anything. That is a massive signal that person is overloaded. What is happening now is not them, it's an autonomic response. So don't buy into that. The second thing I want you to be aware of is, particularly if they separate themselves, the person with ADHD will often calm down relatively quickly because it's an adrenaline hit, right? The adrenaline burns bright, but it burns fast. So they will want to come back and they'll want to re-engage. I beg of you, please, that is not the time to say, yeah, but you shouldn't yell at me like that, okay? They know they shouldn't yell at you like that, but it's not the time to do it. That's the time for just calm re-engagement. Okay, I know you were not feeling good. We will move past this. We're gonna, you bring time into it. We're gonna get beyond this. So, and then just let it sit for a bit, because later, and this might even be a day or two later, when they're in the right position, they may even raise it up, but you are more than welcome to say, hey, look, totally get that things got out of control the other day, but let's talk about some things that we can't have in our relationship. For example, like in our relationship, my wife and I have never used a derogatory term for each other, ever. And that was a deal we made really early on. And I think she made it because she's smarter than me. And I think also too, she probably heard how I talk to other people sometimes. So making sure that you come back and say, yeah, okay, well, look, we can lose it, we can struggle, but there are things, little rules we got to hang by. And for all the people with ADHD out there, I know that traditionally we think, oh, hang on, but it's not me in control then. I debate that. If we have these rules, even when we lose it, we can still hang on to those rules, particularly with the people we love. Now, when we do talk about how those things happen, it's always worthwhile talking about what I call the triggers. So all the things that happen that led up to it, and it'll be the immediate things, like there were 3 TVs on in the room, or that the kids were screaming, or that there was after a long day of work, or that this is a particularly sensitive topic that is open to misinterpretation. Those triggers are very valuable to understand. The thing that is not valuable is everything prior to that. So when we get into these fights, we all become great historians. We'll suddenly remember every single instance that you've done this before. And we'll want to wheel them out as our evidence, like we're in court, to prove that this is a pattern and this is a problem. Well, the big news flash is we know it's a pattern. Everyone knows it's a pattern, okay? Bring up that history, understand the need to work through it and to debrief yourself on that. But in that moment of trying to solve it, it just makes the solution seem impossible. So I ask you, if you can leave that at the door, focus on the triggers, focus on the boundaries that you do not want stepped over, and allow the time to approach them when the person is able to. Okay, so that's enough about autonomic responses. So let's return to now. So here's the overarching views. Like we said with interoception, look inwards, be self-aware, think of your current values, your intent, your strengths, be constantly bringing yourself back to this. My partner and I, Monica, with our clients use a little app called Chime, which is a free app on Apple. There's also ones on Android, like Tell Me the Time, I think is one, or Blip Blip. But basically to make people more time aware, but also use that little trigger to focus in and do a little bit of self-awareness as you go through the day. Because, meditation's wonderful. And please, if you're doing it, keep doing it. But what we need with ADHD is more little mini meditations through the day. And there's these little moments of self-awareness. Okay, so it only takes a few seconds, but we need a trigger because we're not time aware. The second thing that's a benefit to that is it does actually make us aware of the external time. This app will just literally a voice will tell you the time every half an hour or hour, or whatever you set it to. So when we look outwards from our inward perspective, so we do that first, then we look at them in relation to who we are and where we're at, okay? So we look at all these external things, outcomes, actions, demands, triggers that may have made us think of something else. Then we choose. Now, this is a recurring theme with ADHD. I'm guilty of it myself. Is that we tend to lead, as a good friend of mine, Doug Harris, referred to accidental lives. We can just react to things and bounce from one thing to another. I challenge you to look inwards, compare it with what's on offer out there, and then choose the experience you want and how it will best serve you, which ultimately means we prioritize. Finally, we got to make sure we create a strategy. So just choosing it's not enough. We got to say, well, what will I do? So, it's a really common theme when, you work with someone and we work through and say, okay, this is the solution. Great. And we've got a plan for it. Okay. So now what are you actually going to do to make that happen? So put it in time and place. So let's apply that to each of the three areas. The past. So remember we talked about the pancaking past. Well, let's look inwards first. Who am I now? How is now me different to then me? Okay. Then we look outwards. Who or what was going on then, including who was I then? And what triggered this memory of that thing? Because it may have been inconsequential. It may have just been the temperature of the day, the angle of the sun, the type of room I was in, the person I was talking to, whatever. But what triggered the memory? Is it a relevant trigger? Is that alarm, an emotional alarm going off for a good reason, or is it not? If it's just one of those random association things that we do a lot, okay? It's one of the reasons why we tend to be very creative or novelty generating. And we could talk about creativity and ADHD for hours, so we'll leave that for a minute. So let's make that aware. Then choose how me now is going to engage with me then, okay, and that experience. And I like to think of it as me now embracing me then. What would I say is the great way of personifying it. And, when I would work with clients with this, a really recurring theme is they say, I would say, it's okay. And then, no, you know what? I'd just give me a hug and say, it's going to be all right. And I love that. It's just really simple. It's that wisdom of I'm past that and I'm here now, which means there's not going to be a massive negative emotional association with it. And last but not least, when we're looking at the past and we have this healthy relationship with it back in place, create the strategy. What am I going to do with this insight? Now, you might not need to do anything other than just say, hey, good job well done, you've grown. But it might also be, you know what? I recognize there are still some traits in how I dealt with that to what I want to do now that I could make sure I'm more aware of, maybe when, I'm dealing with a difficult person or whatever. So make it useful now. Now let's talk about returning to now the present. So we need to look inwards again. So who am I? What is important right now to me? Look outwards. What is the time? What is available and making demands on my now? Then choose. How will my intent fit into the time I have? Because really that's what matters. That's what we're being assessed on by the world, if they have a right to assess us. But it's whether our intention is being accurately represented. And then let's think about strategy. And look, we could do a whole session on making time concrete. Just a quick takeaway is that with ADHD, we struggle with abstract concepts. We love them, we play with them, but when we have to use them, we struggle because to use an abstract, whether it's time, money, we have to create a concrete version of it because they're all just ideas. right? So what we have to do is we have to use something to do that. And luckily, other clever people have thought of this and they created something called a planner. Or in my country, we call it a diary, but I understand in the US often that's referred to journaling. So they're planners, and the planners have the same size box for months, the same size box for days, the same size box for minutes. You get what I'm talking about here. So it makes it into a very manipulatable concept that we can make very concrete, and we can make sure that we can say, okay, well, that's what that chunk of time looks like across a day or across a week or across years. Okay, so we need to allocate time, including, most importantly, we should always start with our self-care time. We should think about making sure that as we allocate time, that we don't overpack it, that we be aware of the context of who we are and how we're functioning and all the rest of it. Return to the future. Okay, so bringing the future back into now. So again, look into inwards. Who am I now? Who do I want to be? What could deliver that? Then we look outwards. Let's project into the future. Let's do a very granular exploration of, you know what? Let's see. I know. I'm going to go for an overnight camping trip and take pictures of wildflowers with a friend of mine, because it's just a wonderful focus point in being in nature. Haven't done it for a couple of years. So we're going to go and do it. And it's really seasonal in a place called the Granite Belt in Queensland. So please look that up. It's called Girraween. It's gorgeous. Massive granite boulders that were spat there by ancient volcanoes from the coast, which is pretty cool because they're like hundreds of kilometers away. But we're going to go there, right? So now if I want to prepare for that appropriately now, instead of just wait till my friend turns up on my doorstep and said, "Are you ready to go?" I'm going to project myself there. So I'm going to imagine it in the future. I'm going to say, yeah, so we're driving there. So, it's a long drive. So I might want to make sure the car's all checked out. And when we get there, what am I going to do? I'm going to take pictures. I can see myself taking pictures. I need my camera. I'll need a tripod. I'll need, there's all the things I need around that. I'll need my hiking boots. I'll need to make sure the clothes are comfortable for, because now I'm thinking what the temperature's going to be. Where am I going to sleep? All that sort of stuff suddenly comes in, which will create a list of things I can do now to prepare for that. But it's only when I actually get granular, when I imagine myself doing it and living it, that I can actually see that experience. Then I can choose. I can say, well, what do I want that experience to be like? So if I want the experience to be a comfortable overnight sleep, I might do a little bit of work inside my Jeep to make it a little bit more nicer to sleep in for me. And my friend can take care of himself. I might want to make sure I've got extra batteries for the camera, because it would really be horrible if I got out there and the last day I couldn't take any pictures, that sort of thing. And then I can deconstruct that back to now, which by no small coincidence, I will be doing work on the Jeep on the weekend. Okay, and then I think about the strategy. Now, this is a great thing. And actually, if you want to read more about avoiding procrastination, doing things, I've just finished a book with a colleague, a psychologist based in Sydney, Madeline O'Reilly, and we've had a lot of fun looking at how ADHD and procrastination happen. And we've got a book that should be out end of October, beginning November on Amazon. And we are giving a talk at the ADHD conference at the beginning of November as well on that. And I believe we'll be doing an ADDA focused workshop later in the year too, but more will come out about that shortly. But simple thing, how we develop strategy, you think process, how, in other words, how to do it or what to do. What resources will I need, including time? So we've got to put it into time. We've got to use that concrete process of managing time. But we also need to think about what other things we're going to need, including people and gear and all that sort of stuff. And then we've got to put it into context. So if we now see that future is really a series of nows that I'm going to come across each day, then I need to look at each of those nows in their own time environment. So I might say, well, yeah, I'm going to do some work on I might say, hey, I want to do that work on my Jeep tomorrow because I'm really excited about this trip now. I can see myself and I really want to be comfortable. But guess what? I've got a busy day tomorrow, so it doesn't work in the context of tomorrow. So I'll look at the context of the weekend. And I can even look at that in the context of how much effort and energy those nows are going to take. So I might want to break them up. Yep. Okay. So that's how we do it. There's the solution. Let's now talk about some reliability issues. So when you think about ADHD and reliability, I want to bring something really clear to you, which is that the biggest barrier is our own shame and guilt about things not working. It's frustrating, it's hurtful, and it's useless. Shame is a wasted emotion, because if you feel ashamed, you already know it's not what you wanted. That was already your intent. If you don't, if you don't think that, you're not going to feel ashamed, right? Now, I don't want you to feel ashamed, because what I want you to do is do something that little kids are good at doing, which is separate your intent from your action. You are your intentions every single time. You are not always your actions. Our actions sometimes reflect our intention, sometimes they don't. And that's just a system failure thing. Okay? Little kids know that. That's why they do the fib thing. Now, I'd like to think that we sort of should know that as adults. That's maybe why we do the fib thing too, but that's a better way of framing it. And that's why I'd frame it to your partner, is that, hey, when I do that little fib, like, when my wife comes to me and says, so, John, did you take out the garbage bins and for the collection? And I go, yep. And then she'll pause for 2 seconds and say, is that your final answer? And I'll go, nope. I'm going to do it. I have an intention of doing it. I just haven't quite got to it yet, but I will. Thank you for the reminder. And I never use the word nagging. So you are your intent. That's what we want to focus on. If your action doesn't meet your intent, then stop and consciously change it, because you can. Because I guarantee most of the things you hear from any coach or any psychologist, you've probably done at some point. You've probably, wandered across them and done it that way, and it's worked. And often that's what people say, oh, I have done it that way. I was coaching a guy yesterday, and he's a barrister, and he was saying, and we were talking about using a big pad to get all your ideas out so you can see them, to relieve your working memory. And when we talked about it, he said, oh, I do this when I'm doing cross-examinations, right? So have zero tolerance for not delivering your intent. So be tough on yourself about that. Don't be tough on yourself about shame or guilt. So, and I'll zip through this because I know we're pretty well out of time. But so first thing, like we said before, pause, stop. Then we need to focus internally. What was my intent with this? Okay. Then we need to access the external. What got in the way? Because I guarantee every time something doesn't work the way you intended, something got in the way. I guarantee it. So then you generate a solution. You solve what got in the way. And then you direct action to do it again next time in a way that's reliable. And then, and that's a backwards arrow, you review it to make sure that it all worked. Okay, and last but not least, I'll do this quickly. Boundaries. We often think of them as natural enemy of ADHD, but they're actually a great tool for us. If we can create containable, manageable time in terms of boundaries, for example, don't say I've got all day to get that assignment done. Say I'm going to do this task in that hour. Create a sprint, not a marathon. We work better with sprints with ADHD. Create clear points to check the action. So make sure your intent is turned into clear criteria that are measurable. Make sure that you use these boundaries as an opportunity to adapt, not an opportunity to flog yourself. So if you said, I'll do that in an hour and it's taking more than an hour, that's where you stop, you force the boundary and say, okay, that didn't work, didn't meet my intent, what went wrong, let's figure it out. And let's adapt so we don't keep just compounding the problem. Okay, so in summary, we defined ADHD in terms of time. We talked a bit about the understanding of ADHD and time in terms of neurobiology. We created some solutions, and we created some options for reliability. And that's me. So thank you for sitting through my long ramble. And if you've got any questions, I believe, Alan, that's what we're going to do now. Is that right?
Yeah, let's do that. We got a couple of nice comments here. Great presentation. What was the other one? Wonderful talk about time as both a goal and as a means to a goal. I like that. So we've got a few cues in here, questions. I want to get through these pretty snappily here. So one is, first, everyone wants to know, are the slides available? Yes. A link to, well, I don't know if it's the PDF of the slides, yes, and the replay of the video available will be sent out by a link in email tomorrow. Also, just to remind everybody about the book, the title of Jonathan's book is in the chat. And Jonathan, before I get into Q&A, so I don't forget, Is there anything that you want to tell them about how to reach you, or anything in particular you want them to know about in addition to the book that's coming
Oh,
out?
yeah. So if you want to reach out to me, you can find me at John, Jon, at connectadhd.com, and that email address is in the slides too. Or at my website, which is connectadhd.com. Or you can also find me on LinkedIn. And that's another way of connecting with me.
Great. Awesome. So let's see, where did that, there was, okay. So how you describe, this is interesting, how you describe ADHD past to present sounds just like how those with PTSD experience a past event. That was interesting. How is it similar and how is it different?
That's a really interesting area. There's lots of
Yeah,
work being
yeah.
done in that area. And I still remember when I first got involved with ADHD like 20 years ago, in the clinical setting. A psychiatrist over here, Ken Piaggio, huge respect. He was one of the, these early pioneers who withstood the doubt and the challenges and did the right thing for our people. He said, you know what? There's a lot of trauma associated with ADHD, to the point of even PTSD, and that's always stayed with me. So I think when we break it down, when we think about what PTSD is, to my level of understanding at least, is that it's an intense encoding of a reaction to an intense threat. And that threat can be built up over time with sustained exposure, usually in things like war, but it also can be single incidence things. And Again, it comes back to that encoding with the default mode network, making very strong associations to a trigger. So in other words, if helicopters make me jump, it's because I've got a strong audio association with that says threat, danger. Okay, so that's probably where that connection is. However, as I said, there's often, I think, more trauma associated with ADHD than we give attention to. Constant negative feedback, constant feeling like I'm not in control, and then you bundle into that I have never coached. Like, I've coached hundreds of people from all over the world. I've never coached anyone without some underlying anxiety issues going on,
Yeah.
diagnosed or
Yes.
not. Right. So it all makes, and if you think about it, if you're not in control of your immediate future, which is with poor executive function, or inconsistent executive function is what it feels like, then that sort of would make sense that you would feel anxious, that you would struggle with that. So I hope that
I
answers the
call
question.
it, yeah, I think you nailed it. And I call it, for the ADHD tribe, I call it PTSD light, because you don't want to be taking PTSD lightly or throwing that term around. This is serious, serious business. But as you say, the constant foibles, the mistakes, the getting yelled at, the embarrassments and the shame, it does create that little bit of that scar tissue that I call PTSD light. I think so. That was a great question.
I love that
Um,
term,
uh,
by the way, PTSD light. I'm pinching that.
please do, please do. Um, let's see. So can you offer some tips, resources on the memory aspect in that ecosystem?
All right.
Tips
Yeah.
on the memory aspect.
So memory and ADHD is an interesting thing, and we need to, I think, be much clearer in our definitions around it. So in terms of long-term memory, our long-term memory is really good. We actually, there's been lots of studies that have shown with kids with ADHD, their retained memory is actually pretty good. What we tend to struggle with is the breadcrumbs to that memory. So if you like, the filing system, and it's probably because the way we learn stuff is quite intensive. Either it's a big emotional hit or it's a big emotional drive towards, and we tend to absorb it all and then we move on. We often don't, again, use that self-reference to say, okay, well, where am I at now, and how am I associating that, and create the breadcrumbs. So, for example, when I'm working with students and getting them to work on improving their memory access, I get them to do things like create a memory palace. You create in your house, you create areas where you put memories on the walls of the information you're trying to learn. The bigger issue with ADHD, I think, is the working memory component. So now working memory, even though it's referred to as memory, and it gets the term short-term memory, but that's erroneous because it's nothing to do with how long we hold the memory in mind. It's about how much information we can hold in mind to manipulate. So it's like the sandbox where we bring in all these bits of information and we're going to manipulate them, stick them together, compare, contrast, prioritize, all that sort of thing, even including shopping lists, right? So now with that is where we have a problem with capacity. And I mean, and inconsistency in that capacity is a big problem. Now, everybody else with working memory issues, everyone else in the world with working memory, their working memory tends to be a bit better, but it tends to be more consistent. So they tend to create adaptive strategies much more easily and reliably. Like, if I said to my wife, she said, I'm going to the shops and would you need anything? If I got up to 4 things, she would say, okay, just pause. I'm going to go and grab my notepad and write it down.
That's right.
If
Yeah.
that was reversed, she could get up to 12 things and I'd be going, yep, got it. Yep, got it. And I'd try and just go off and do it, right? So it's about creating compensatory strategies around working memory. So get it out of your head, get it onto paper is a good example.
Get it out of your head. Get it out of your head. I think that's a big thing, is that we walk around expecting that we should be able to remember these things because so-and-so can remember it. And we really, we have to get the compensatory stuff working for us and remember that, you know what, I'm not going to be able to remember that. This is why this is always with me, wherever all right. So, and that's my alarm, because I got to get ready for another thing at the top of the hour. But I want to do one quick one and then one more. What is the name of the woman in Canada that you mentioned who has good info on ADHD and creativity? Do you remember?
Now she's not ADHD. It's Eve Marie. Hang on, let me just do Houdon. Eve Marie Bluon Houdon, but she's not. She looks at the psychology of creativity. It's not ADHD specific. If you want to see a really great thing on creativity, look up Rex Jung, Jung, and he's a professor. He's looking at creativity from the average presentation, but when you read it, you'll register. The ADHD version is like the flip version of that. We have no trouble with the novelty, the new idea. What we struggle with is the utility, which is turning it into reality. Other people struggle with the novelty because they move to utility very quickly. So that's why we're great brainstormers. That's why we come up with lots of variants.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Can you just spell the last name of the
Rex Jung, Jung? Is that the one you wanted?
Oh no, but no, the first one that you mentioned.
Bluon Houdon.
Even though
Bluon Houdon is
just her last name.
Yeah, BLOUIN-HUDON.
Thank you. Someone asked that question. All right, last question. I often avoid important and valued tasks because they bring up pain. This kind of comes back to the PTSD, the PTSD light. That things that bring up painful memories of failure and feeling inferior, right? So I avoid these tasks and focus externally to avoid focusing on me. And I don't know exactly what the asker means by that, focusing externally, but my interpretation of that is I will go off and do something else. I will go off and I will avoid this task and go, let me just go do this, right? How to start dealing with these things are associated with previous failures.
Yep, cool. Good point. And that's a really good, whoever wrote that, that's a wonderful thing to bring up, because we can't ignore the fact that we've got cumulative experience. Like we're talking about these traumas, right? That if we have a pattern of struggling with this stuff and what you're calling failures, of course, we're going to have an immediate association with a negative thing we should avoid. So the trick to notice is that, remember that picture with the neural networks, when we turn on our attention, it down-regulates our emotion. It actually takes some of the sting out of it. It's why we get upset people to explain to us what happened to them, because turning it into language for me to understand is a really attentional task. So what I'd encourage you to do, and this is something we talk about in our book, but it's about organize the attentional side of thinking through it, the imagining of it, the planning. So if you sit down and start with the end result, if that was to happen the way I wanted to, what would that be like? And what would that look like? And then I just started decoding it. So this is not about doing it yet. This is just about, I'm going to break it down into steps, deconstructing it back. So I haven't even committed to doing it yet, right? I will lay money. By the time you get back to that first step, you'll go, oh, I could do that. And you'll feel, and then the next part is to put it into time. Okay. And then use those time boundaries to check yourself. But I've actually coached several people in the last 2 days on that exact experience. A lot of people will talk about, I get headaches or I get, fuzzy, foggy brain when I look at a blank page. And even talking through the process with me and deconstructing it, by the time I finished, I said, well, you look like you're different there now. You're sitting straighter, you're engaged. And I said, how do you feel? And they said, oh, I want to do it. I can do that.
How do you feel? I want to do it. That's called some good coaching right there. All right. Listen, Jonathan, thank you so much. By the way, I want to tip my hat to you also, because you said something really neat that I'm a big believer in. That is when you talked about the conflict and you had that timeline of, the triggers and then the incident. And you said something really important that I just want to reiterate, which is don't expect to have anything good happen in the moment or right after. Just drop the expectations. That you read so many things about, how to deal with emotional dysregulation or, a tantrum or a panic or this and that. We don't have access to our frontal cortex when this happens. And so we really have to focus on more on the before and the after. So I just want to say thank you for sharing that. We need to hear more about that very real, honest truth. All right. Everybody, please say thank you to Jonathan here. Check out his website. Janine, thank you back in the background for always posting those links and everything. Thank you, ADDA members, for being members. And if you're not a member, please click the link that Janine has posted or will post and join this amazing organization and get all the many, many benefits of being a member. Remember, whatever's in your way, folks, it's yours to crush. You just keep learning and keep doing the doing. All right. And I'm going to fly. God bless all.
Thanks, Alan. Take care.
See you, Jonathan. Bye.